Okay, so hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. For those who don't know, I'm Daisy. I'm the leader of the Scottish chapter of Zebras Unite, and you can otherwise find me doing social investment in Scotland or ranting about stuff on Twitter. And I'll be co-hosting about this event with Esme. Esme, do you want to say hello?
Yes, hi, I'm Esme. I'm the chapter lead for London. I'm sort of personally interested in democratizing access to capital for underrepresented founders, whether that is VC-backed funding or alternative forms of financing. I do this mainly through working with early stage startups, helping them build traction and ultimately secure their funding, and also by supporting and leading Zebras.
Okay, lovely stuff. So just for what's going to happen over the next hour, we're going to have a conversation with Astrid, one of the co-founders of the Zebras Unite movement, which is very exciting, not least because we're going to talk about the future of zebras, about what the movement is building right now and what we can look forward to. And this will be the first of a series of online events brought to you in collaboration between the Scottish and London Zebras, to really enable us to connect and talk about these things and get things moving, because now is absolutely the right time to be talking about how we do business better. And so we are all very excited to bring you over the next few months a different topic each month as we go deeper into the things that matter to us. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Astrid, who is one of the four co-founders of Zebras Unite. Astrid, would you like to say a little bit about yourself and what's your Zebras Unite story? How did you get involved? I think I need to unmute you.
Yes, you have all the power, Daisy. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. My background. So my name is Astrid Scholz. I am an entrepreneur. I'm a recovering nonprofit executive turned entrepreneur, turned tech entrepreneur. Liberated myself from 15 years working in the social change industry about 5 years ago to build a technology and system design firm that helps us accelerate the pace of change and facilitates collaboration across a distributed network of people who have to come together for trying to solve things like now COVID or climate change or what have you, and very quickly discovered that that was a difficult thing to try and get financed. And so my own experience as an entrepreneur led me in a very direct path to intersect with Mara and Jen and Anir, who were having similar experiences, building companies that were trying to solve problems through business that affect all of us, and not finding much love in traditional venture, nor for that matter in traditional impact investing. And so we put our heads together and started thinking about what we were reflecting on what we were experiencing, and sort of analyzing the patterns we saw. And of course that led to the blog post about 3.5 years ago now, Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break, which was preceded by a rather funny piece that Jen and Mara had written called Sex and Startups, which I highly recommend. It was sort of, for me, it was sort of the aha moment that, hey, there are other people who think like this, who have this experience of running into venture capitalists who just didn't seem to be getting what we're building. And of course, they worked a very funny metaphor with bodily functions and sex and what have you. Was an attention grabber. But then the next piece is where we really articulated some initial principles around the zebras, and then discovered, to our delight and our surprise, just how much that resonated around the world. And so here we are.
Perfect. Okay, now before we get into the nitty-gritty, there will be time for questions and answers later on. So please, can you put your questions in the chat, just either as I occur to you or later on when we get to that. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what is the vision of Zebras Unite? What does a beautiful zebra future look like?
A beautiful zebra future. Well, as many of you know, I think we initially started out describing ourselves sort of in differentiation from unicorns, right? The unicorn myth, that narrative is just so pervasive, right? So, and the way that showed up for me is that even in impact investing circles, people have adopted these really high return expectations. I remember vividly having a conversation with an impact investing officer of a major foundation here in the US who said, well, come back when you have $1 million in ARR. I said, well, that's what the VCs tell me. You know, so how are you different? How are you an impact investor? And so we initially said what we're not, right? So we're real, unlike unicorns that are mythical creatures, right? These are real businesses solving real problems using the market mechanisms, using entrepreneurship. We are driven, we're motivated by profit and purpose. We are treating our customers as community, not as something that you churn. We tend to care about our community and tend to have sort of a bigger remit than just cranking out whatever products or services we're building. And so when you put all these things together, you know, the sort of taking care of customers, taking care of community, taking care of your employees, building things that matter, right? Using the mechanisms of business, you end up in a future that is more resilient and more inclusive than what we're experiencing now, where, you know, we have a vibrant economy that actually and vibrant markets, right? That help provide the things that we all need to live well, and do it in ways that that actually create wealth and opportunity for everybody, right? So we believe that everybody has the right to imagine the future. And so when you lead with that, you realize that there are a whole bunch of barriers that we have to remove. And then the flip side of that is this vision where, you know, everybody who has an idea for a business, you know, based on their lived experience, can bring that into the fullest articulation of their vision.
Mm. Sounds good. So yeah, and so when we talk about the different types and sizes of businesses, because I think that a part of this is about not just growing everything to the biggest of the big, but about growing to the right size for your market, which I think is not something we hear very often about startups in particular.
Yeah, I think that's again where this sort of unicorn myth is just so damaging, right? Because if you're, I mean, it almost doesn't matter what kind of business you're building, like, but what's wrong with having a business in the tens or hundreds of millions? Like, I mean, a unicorn valuation is literally $1 billion valuation or higher. What's wrong with building a portfolio of companies that are generating tens or hundreds of millions in revenues? Right. And so I feel like we have lost track that there is just a whole raft of really interesting things that can be created by private businesses, by private enterprise, that serve a need, that solve some interesting and urgent problems, and oh, by the way, also make a really good living for the founders and the employees. And so, so I think where we have, and that's where we sort of need to color in some new options, right? Like both in terms of the imagination, you know, that we can imagine a very successful companies that are not either a unicorn or, you know, as they're sometimes dismissively called, a lifestyle enterprise, right? But there's a whole range of options in between. And there's a whole range of business models. There's a whole range of capital options and tools that we need to grow these diverse and sort of differently sized businesses across all sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that Esme and I hear about quite a lot from the people who hear about the Zebra idea and want to get involved and understand what it's about and see if there are different paths through entrepreneurship for them. Esme, do you want to take some questions?
Yes, I mean, I think what people might be interested to know from you, Astrid, is what is Zebras Unite doing about this right now? What are we trying to build?
Yeah, so so when we stepped out with the initial manifesto, you know, and I've been teaching my American co-founders that the pronunciation is in fact zebra, not zebra, because it wanted to be international right from the get-go. And you might be able to tell I've spent some time in the UK. I did some of my university education in Scotland and England, and so what's been fascinating is the moment we stepped out with these principles, so many people came to us and said, you know, I'm building a zebra company. I want to invest in zebras. Where do I find resources and help? And the one of the pervasive patterns was that people said, oh gosh, there are other people like me. I was feeling so lonely. You know, I was feeling lonely in Silicon Valley. I was feeling lonely in Bristol or in London or wherever you might be, right? And so we spent a fair bit of time, you know, we brought everybody together here in Portland, of all places, in November, which is like not the most charming time of year to be in Portland, Oregon. And about 200 people came, and it sort of set us on this path of listening to the community for the better part of a year and a half, to figure out what's most needed. And you know, long story short, what's most needed is capital, community, and culture, right? And so that's really the trifecta. The three big thrusts of our strategy is to inform culture and cultural change in how we think about business and the startup environment, create community, right? Both online and in chapters, and both London and Scotland are some of our earliest chapters and very active chapters. And then capital, like a big focus is, well, if the capital doesn't exist, if so many of us are having these frustrating experiences with sort of on the VC side of the spectrum, well, then let's just grow our own capital already, right? And so there's a combination of make your own, you know, create your own capital, and also help entrepreneurs navigate to the capital that's right for them and their business at the time, at whatever life stage they're at. So it's a combination of navigation and new capital.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Daisy would agree with this. I mean, from the founders that we speak to, that's definitely something, you know, a big gap that's missing. You know, what do you do if you're not, you know, a business that's going to go for VC funding, but you're not an NGO? And actually, most businesses land in between those two things, but there's remarkably doesn't seem to be much there. So yeah, I mean, this is very exciting. But what does this change mean for the UK and for sort of other regional chapters?
Well, yeah. So there's a number of things happening, kind of all at once, and I want to you know, maybe reflect on your last observation for a minute. So, you know, when you think about venture capital, it's actually a tiny slice of the capital spectrum. It gets this disproportionate attention in media and in the sort of popular imagination. And then there's actually, and then of course there's debt financing, there are loans. I know in the UK, you've got some really interesting tax structures that advantage early stage investing into social enterprises, for example. But then there's like the whole rest of the capital spectrum that's not really well developed. And I always compare it to ice cream shops. You know, it's like having an ice cream shop that only sells vanilla and chocolate. I mean, how boring, right? Where's the diversity of flavors of capital? And so we actually see a great deal of opportunity around, you know, not coming into other countries and places to sort of usurp what's already there, but work with the existing entrepreneur and capital and investment ecosystem to identify some new opportunities around what would be most useful, right? And then help support the creation and formation of that capital, right? And so we have done, you know, we did a big survey last year of companies, and what we find sort of generally to be true are sort of three prevailing patterns. One is, we need globally, I would say, we need non-dilutive early stage financing. And non-dilutive can mean debt-based, but it can also mean, like when you're, you know, if you're looking at the US, where all of a sudden, you know, racial injustice is getting finally, right, its moment of recognition, how big a deal that is, and how it impedes progress. When you look at some of the statistics, right, for example, Black families have 1/14 the wealth of white families. So entrepreneurs coming out of those communities don't have friends and family rounds they can raise. So non-dilutive financing could include grants and fellowships to basically provide some runway for an entrepreneur to figure it out, like take a year and figure out what this enterprise wants to be. And so we see a lot of opportunity to innovate at that early stage of the spectrum. We see a second need around patient growth stage financing. And that's anybody, I would say, who is revenue positive and needs to get to the next phase of growth. And there are some really interesting experiments with sort of revenue-based financing that can be more equity-like or more debt-like, depending on how you structure it. You may be familiar with funds like Indie VC, for example. Well, if you take all the revenue-based finance funds, revenue-based investment funds in the world and put them together, I don't think you break $150 million yet. So again, it's a tiny, huge opportunity to innovate and tiny volume, tiny by volume, right? And so we see a possibility for Zebras Unite to create something new in that space, and again, not be competing with Indie and others, but actually adding just to the supply of capital. And then there's a third area that's really fascinating to us, where you have more mature companies that, for a variety of reasons, should or could refinance themselves and basically rejigger their capital stacks. For example, because they are planning an exit to community and are, to your point, and to your interest, Esme, radically democratize ownership. Or because they are a distressed unicorn asset, right? Last year, we found ourselves in a very interesting conversation with potential investors around there's a big community meeting platform called Meetup that many of you may know, that had been bought by WeWork. And as WeWork went up in flames, they tried selling some of their assets, and Meetup came onto the market. And it illustrated to us an interesting opportunity, essentially around patient private equity. Right, and so I think the same is true in many parts of the world, that there will be interesting companies that could be essentially flipped into a Zebra ethos, if you will, could be exiting to community or similar, and so you need capital to do that. And so those are roughly the three prongs of our capital strategy. And one of the ways we look to execute on that strategy is in partnership with local actors. So in the UK, we're actually in a very interesting conversation with Big Issue Invest about what it would look like to create an early stage equity instrument to support Zebra companies. So we'll hopefully have more to say about that in the not too distant future. And I think I may have seen Johnny Page, who's on the call here today. So we can put him on the spot if we want.
Yeah, I mean, we're all very excited about what the potential is, particularly for the UK, and what we can be doing for more founders. I just have one more question. I don't know, Daisy, if you have any more questions before we go to the Q&A, but I was just wondering if you were an early stage founder right now in the UK, and you weren't, looking for VC funding, like what would you do? Where would you go?
Go to your customers, right? I mean, it's like revenue is your best investment strategy, and so I think that's universally true. I think it creates a good discipline for your business, right? It really helps you understand your sort of the bones of your business, and then I think there are some interesting opportunities sort of forthcoming, right? To think about where you might find this sort of growth stage capital. But I would go and get smart about how you can grow your business by growing your customers. And I think there's some, and we'll be working obviously with you, Esme, and Daisy and others in the UK about figuring out what kind of resources need to be developed for founders to educate themselves and help each other. Sort of in that path to growing sustainable businesses, because my impression is that it's just easier to encounter the information about sort of standard incubators and accelerators, just like it's easier to encounter the information about VC, And so what we have to do to some extent is just counter, right? Like with information about the alternative resources. And so that's very exciting. Of course, you know, everybody should join Zebras Unite and join your chapters. That seems like a no-brainer to begin to create that sort of peer support. And one of the things we're working on, in addition to working on capital, is an internal marketplace for founders to find each other and find resources that could help them, right? For example, one thing that drives me crazy as a business owner is, like, where do I find Zebra-aligned accountants or lawyers, right? Like, how do you actually find some of these professional resources? And so that's all part of what's driving our own transition of Zebras Unite to a cooperative. Like, we actually see it as a mechanism that supports all of our businesses. And so as a member of the cooperative, you then have preferential access to whether it's capital or talent or services that helps you grow your business, right? So that's why we're making that switch.
If I can just ask a question on that. In many ways, Zebras Unite is kind of a startup itself, isn't it?
And oh yeah.
We've all been learning as we go along, and you're a little bit ahead in the US in terms of standing up these new structures and working with partners. What have been your learning so far about what that process looks like and how to do it?
You know, I think the eye opener again and again is that form needs to follow function, right? So with Zebras, I would say, I'm not sure it's a mistake, right? But the instinct was to, let's just hang it off an existing nonprofit for a bit because that makes it easy to attract sponsorships and grants. But really what it wants to be a cooperative that is actually owned by all of us who are building these businesses for the future, so that we can actually materially benefit from building the new future. Like, I can't say that often enough, right? Like, it's actually, like, it's a mechanism to reward ourselves for building businesses that are better for the world. And so then the structure just has to follow it, even though it seems, and I've talked to some wonderful people at Cooperatives of the UK who've been very helpful in helping us think through all this. Even though it takes a bit of an adjustment, right? Because even most cooperative structures aren't set up for this sort of, you know, globally networked platform co-op that wants to be Zebras Unite now, which is what Zebras Unite wants to be. And so I think the big lesson is you stick to your guns, you stick to your principles, right? And then you build accordingly. And so we're in the middle of this transition now, where we're standing up the cooperative. The nonprofit will actually hold a golden share in the cooperative, so it serves as the ultimate mission backstop. And then the cooperative, in a joint venture with our partners at Second Muse Capital, creates a subsidiary, Zebras Unite Capital, which basically becomes the investment company for this outfit. And now we set up a mutualistic structure, right, where all of us as members benefit from, for example, the investment activities, whether or not our own companies are recipient of any direct investments. And so we're basically trying to structure it as a virtuous cycle.
Vika from Co-ops UK was in fact on the call, but unfortunately she had to drop off, so we can no longer put her on the spot about that. And Esme, did you have any more questions before we go to?
No, let's go for the Q&A. Let's have a look what we have. So from Gary, since Zebras Unite's inception, how much has the alternative finance sector increased? What is Zebras Unite's impact in numbers, and what is the next target?
It's a tricky one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, and I don't have a good answer, Gary. It seems to me like what has increased is the awareness that there are alternative actors out there. You know, I don't know that we have seen a radical increase in funds being raised yet. What we have seen is people coming out of the woodwork who have been using sort of blended strategies or revenue-based strategies. And you add all up, no, it's still relatively small. I would say it's still very small. And I don't know that anybody has tried to calculate it rigorously, right? Because you could make the case that in impact investing, especially in emerging markets, there's been a ton of experimentation with mezzanine debt structures, et cetera. We've just not tended to apply those same kinds of tools to more developed economies, right? And so if you were to take a global look, you can probably claim much of impact investing under that number, but I don't think that's what you're asking. I think what we're asking is, like, what's the volume of new capital that's available to entrepreneurs in the UK or the US? And I think that's still a small number in the US, under 150 million, I would say. And I don't think we can take credit for that. I think there have been actors like IndieVC or Earnest Capital and others who've been steadily chipping away at it, who are now adding to this sort of rainbow of options that's beginning to pop up.
Yeah, it's unfortunate we don't have an Indie or an Earnest equivalent in the UK or even in Europe yet, as far as I'm aware. Keep asking the question, but
yeah. So I would like to say that we'd want to mobilize $1 billion in the next 3 years, right? And that could take the form of no pressure now, Johnny. A number of funds that we stand up in partnership, and there's a lot of interest, in the UK and the US, in Singapore and in Japan, to name a few, where in working with local partners and local chapter leads, I think we could do some really interesting, innovative finance where you get some big players. There's a lot of interest from some major foundations to help catalyze sort of these new buckets of capital.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to the next question. Sarah says, if we're building alternative business models, what alternative can we have to the term bootstrapping to make it sound less painful and more of a strategy?
Yeah, I think it's revenue funding, right? Like, you could call it revenue funded, and you pat yourself on the back for or call it profit seeking, right? I mean, I think you're basically, if you're focusing on sales and you're focusing on your customer, you're not growing at all cost, right? Like, you're not doing what Facebook and others have done in the early stages, where it's just about growing user base, but you don't even have a revenue model yet. Anybody who has a revenue model is seeking to get to profit sooner rather than later. So I would insist on that and call it revenue.
Another question from Clarice, or Clarissa, I'm saying it right. What do you think about Innovate UK's grant funding? How accommodating are they to early stage Zebras?
Well, I suspect you and Daisy may know more about that. I'm curious what
Gary knows,
Yeah.
who has just won Innovate UK funding. So after 5 attempts, so it sounds like it's tricky, but it's possible. Esme, I don't know if you know anyone else who's won it.
Yeah, no, I know a few people who've got them, but as Gary has said, it seems to be more a game of practice and understanding the system. I think is a big part of it, and I know a lot of people get help on that and get consultants that have done it before, because a lot of it is just like a repetitive process. I would say, but I'd say that they are accommodating. Yeah.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's quite the case for a lot of big grants, that they're a revenue stream for people who know how to write grant applications.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, my general take on a grant-based mechanism is you have to approach it as an investor, right? So I would, whatever we end up doing with grants in the Zebras Unite Capital strategy, we'll approach that as an investment. So it'll be just pipeline cultivation the way we do it, not a responsive grant process. I have a real challenge around treating entrepreneurs seeking capital like you would a responsive grant mechanism in philanthropy, right? Because I mean, all a grant is, it's an investment with a minus 100% return expectation, right? Or if you make it recoverable, maybe it has a 0% return expectation. But it's I would approach it as an investor would, right? Where you have a number of mechanisms available, and then you want to do your cultivation and your pipeline and your discovery. And the scrutiny of the entities, the company's financials, just like with any other investment, it happens just so that the particular tool or product you're using is a grant. So just the fact that it's a responsive grant process gives me pause.
Okay, so next question from Yonka. She says, what do you think of angel syndicates where all angels invest small amounts to help open up the early stage space to underrepresented investors?
Well, I think in general, angel syndicates are a great tool, and we've actually thought about what it would look like to to stand up sort of a Zebra syndicate on things like AngelList, you know, because it's a good way to attract like-minded investors, which is another one of those, you know, hard to broker networks. Like how do you find aligned investors? And so I think angel syndicates are a very interesting way to go there.
Yeah. Do you think that the exit sort of conundrum also plays a part there about what the angels are expecting from their investment?
Yeah, I think I was recently talking to a founder who was just super clear about you know, their exit strategy from the get-go, and said, you know, we expect to get bought, right? And we expect to be able to offer you whatever 3x of your investment. And so I think you can address a lot of those concerns with being really clear with your investors about the kind of exit that you're trying to structure, right? And then in fact, that's what they call structured exits. And then angels have to make a decision about that, right? Whether or not that's right for them. But I kind of feel like that's manageable, and maybe it's just something that we need to create more of a set of tools and practices around as founders, right? To create that clarity, so that you can, and that's sort of the perennial challenge, right? Like matching up the right the investors with the right founders, right? And that's part of what we're hoping to add value to the community and facilitate that navigation for both sides.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a communication thing there. You have to have quite a strong relationship to be able to have that conversation about what are your expectations and what does the exit actually look like. And I think a lot of founders aren't really sure how to talk about that. So some tools and support.
Well, and again, yeah, so I think again, it comes down to sort of the unicorn narrative is just so pervasive, right? Like where you, as a founder, you have learned to draw your hockey stick financial projections, and you're making grandiose statements about IPOs. And it's sort of the missing art is to say, well, actually, here's my strategy for how I grow customers and revenue, and here's therefore what I can offer you as a revenue-based instrument as an investor. You know, maybe we get to 3x in 5 to 7 years, or you say, well, it's you know, I'm you know, my goal is to get acquired by this short list of buyers who are who are larger companies than I am. So I think there is it's doable, right? But maybe we have lost that skill set and need to just reinvigorate it.
If anybody has any other questions, please do keep them coming in. Anything from you, Esme? 1 minute.
I suppose like what I'm interested to see is, you know, obviously in this time of, you know, sort of such massive changes, you know, the pandemic, and also as you mentioned earlier, the you know, the highlighting of these racial injustices that we're seeing across the US and in the UK. You know, what place does Zebras Unite play in that role of changing the structures that currently exist?
Yeah, so so as Zebras Unite, we've from the get-go been deliberately intersectional, right? And not surprisingly, when you describe the challenges with access to capital, you hear from a lot of people of color and women and you know, other various groups that have been disenfranchised from mainstream capital markets. And so in solving for those problems, you end up making hopefully the right innovation in the right direction, right? And so we're doing a number of things. But here in the US, for example, we're working with a group of community fund managers and technical assistance providers who are predominantly working in Black and Brown communities, where we are essentially in the process of designing a decentralized democratic infrastructure for mobilizing capital and technical assistance. And the idea is that that structure would in fact be owned by those community groups to begin with. So again, you're radically shifting power, right? It's about shifting power into the hands of people who are of the communities that are currently underserved, including in how you create capital instruments or these new financial structures. And so it becomes a design principle, right? And the same would be true in other countries. Like when you think about how do you involve communities that are traditionally overlooked or have become overlooked by mainstream financial markets, how do you materially involve them in the solving of the problem, right? And that to me always translates into ownership, right? And again, why we're turning Zebras Unite into a cooperative. Like we need to own, you need to own the mechanism of your own liberation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think, it's about, democratizing the access to capital so that people, are in a place to create the change that they want to see. One more question about creating chapters. So I know that there might be some people on this webinar who are interested in creating chapters in their own regions or in their own countries. How would you advise people going about that?
Well, we're in the process of creating a bit of a toolkit based on the experience of our groundbreaking chapter leads like Esme and Daisy. We're trying to make it super easy from the co-op perspective for people who are interested in creating a local community of founders and investors to do so, right? So there'll be essentially a playbook around how you get a website, how you get an email for your chapter, some help with creating sort of some initial events, and then support in terms of the tools you can use. And the basic insight is, I mean, at some point we will all be released from house arrest and may be able to interact again in coffee shops and whatnot. But the very basic insight is that the challenges that Zebra entrepreneurs, Zebra founders are facing are similar around the world, and then the specifics obviously are different. And that's where you want to have the local ability to solve some of these issues. And so from our perspective, we're trying to make that as easy as possible, right? So people can, at the moment, declare themselves, either to any of us here on the call or join what's currently the global community is currently hosted on Mighty Network. So if you go to zebrasunite.mn.co, and that's where you can then interact with folks like myself to get started on setting up a chapter.
I think you probably touched on Sarah's question there. She says, how much does Zebras Unite focused on US investment development, and is it possible to create international investment options for Zebra companies, or will those have to be country specific?
No, that's a really good question, Sarah. So it's a both and strategy, right? So we have because of the nature of investment and securities regulations, you have to figure out what kind of jurisdiction you're going to be under to make investments at some point. But the notion is to have ZebraNet Capital be able to invest directly into any of our member companies, right? So that would be international from the get-go. And then when it comes to standing up particular funds, we might do that in partnership in specific jurisdictions, right? So it's either a case of we're going to invest directly as Zebras Unite, Zebras Unite Capital, or we're going to invest through one of these fund vehicles that are likely to be anchored in a particular jurisdiction.
Let's have a look. Could you tell us a bit more about what you're working on with Big Issue Invest?
I'd love to put Johnny on the spot. Is that possible? Can we give him a minute? Is he still here?
I think so.
Yeah,
This was not planned, Johnny. So if you don't want to do it, I'm happy to.
I am still here. Being put well on the spot.
Hey,
Trying to
Johnny.
stay quiet in a corner. Do you want me to, I can speak briefly to what we're doing. That's okay. Yeah. So I mean, this all comes back to reading actually the blogs that Astrid alluded to, that they wrote way back when, and I read them and realised it was actually quite a big pain point for the type of investees or pipeline that we were generating at Big Issue Invest. So Big Issue Invest is a social investor, but I think like lots of social investors in the UK is predominantly debt focused. And I've been a Big Issue Investor for a couple of years now, and right from the get-go realised that this was quite a big problem for us, that we were kind of missing quite a big area of the market, and lots of social enterprises, it's reasonably incestuous, if I can use that word, lots of social enterprises that we know well come back for more, and lots of social enterprises know the debt products very, very well, but what they don't know is when we start talking about kind of quasi-equity type structures or a straight equity play. So it was quite an interesting pain point for us, realising there were lots of organisations that we, quite frankly, were not able to service that needed servicing. And so we kind of came at it from that angle. So we are at the very, very early stages of designing what an equity kind of type fund could look like, with a big emphasis on testing and experimenting with different structures and different investment products. So we're doing that as well in partnership, but I'll preserve the anonymity of the partner for the time being, because everything is so informal at the moment. So there's a couple of us working away at it, and the plan is that hopefully in the next coming months there should be something more formal announced, but that's what we're about. Is that going to address the question?
Yeah, very exciting. Thank you for your impromptu participation, Johnny.
Oh, not a problem at all. It's a pleasure.
And I think it also touches on, I didn't mention that Kenny actually made a comment about on the angel question before, that we see Social Investment Scotland also kind of moving into that space with their CIS ventures. So I think there is definitely this feeling of momentum, particularly amongst social investment, of moving from just asset-locked social enterprises who don't know or can't access equity investment into how can we serve those other businesses. So yeah, interesting momentum.
Yeah.
Okay. Got anything else?
Yes, there's one more question from Yonka. How can we start to collect data on zebras? Do you already have data we can use to build upon?
Well, that's a good question. So essentially, right, what we have decided to do is we're going to own the data as a community, right? So we are now as a cooperative, right? Like part of what we're keen on is figuring out everything there is to know about zebras, right? In order to then create products and services that serve all of us, right? So there will be data products that we might want to make available to researchers, right, and others. But that would be as part of a deliberate business strategy of the cooperative, right? So the idea that we're doing this, and this is this may sound weird, right? But we're not creating a public good here, right? I mean, we are, but we're doing it in a way that actually materially benefits all the zebra companies in the world, right? It's not like so we're taking agency, I guess, is another way of saying this. And so that's why we're encouraging people to, join the community, join the cooperative, to actually be the masters and mistresses of our own destiny, instead of other people talking about it, taking these ideas and then doing God knows what with them. We're actually saying, no, wait a minute. There is these principles and how we execute on them are actually quite valuable. And the people who should benefit from any material value that's created are, in fact, the founders themselves. Right? So hence, if you're not familiar with cooperatives, I urge you to start thinking about that, because we're creating this new world, this new economy, right? And so we're now in the process of creating a structure that rewards us for that moment of creation, right? And so as and when we collect data, we will be very deliberate about who we share them with and how we make them available, because that's a driver of value for the community, and we're not going to just give it up, so to speak.
Absolutely.
What a notion. Getting rewarded for building a better economy, right?
And on that, Sarah is clearly keen to be that. She says, I'm a member of the community, but is there something else I need to do to join the cooperative?
Yes, there is. And we're about to start socializing that. We're launching another blog post that will outline this process a little bit better, and we will have some global programming around what it means for the community to become a cooperative. There will be, like in any cooperative, a very small sort of buy-in amount and an annual membership fee that then entitles you to member-only type services and offerings, including access to referrals, access to capital, all the good stuff that we're all after. And so yes, there will be an onboarding process to become a cooperative member in addition to being a community member.
Excellent, very exciting. Okay, we've probably got time for one more question. If anybody has anything burning that they need to ask. Esme, have you got anything else before we wrap up?
Nope.
Okie dokie then. Well, just left to say thank you so much, Astrid, for coming on. And there is clearly so many exciting things happening for us to look forward to around the world and here in the UK. I think next to say is if you're in Scotland, please join the Scottish community. We have a new online platform where we can meet up and until we can actually meet physically and leave our own four walls. And that's at the Community Lab, and I'll send out a link for that. And Esme, is there anything you want to cover for the London chapter?
Yes. For the London chapter, we currently have a community on Slack where we, exist to share resources, to share our learnings, to, meet, well, virtually like-minded people who are zebras. I also have a newsletter that I have relaunched this month. I hope it will end up being a valuable newsletter for people to build sustainable and ethical businesses. We will be sending out these links at the end if anyone wants to join any of these things. We'd obviously love to have you there. In terms of our next event, as Daisy mentioned, we are launching an event series. There's more coming. This is not it. We will be launching a virtual meet and greet. There's been a lot of call from lots of members to actually, even in a virtual sense, meet each other. So the plan is here to, again, join forces with the Scottish chapter so that we can all meet each other. This will be a community event only, so you will need to sign up to attend. We found this very fun platform which will hopefully allow you to have sort of one-on-one conversations, so you can meet lots of people and learn from each other. Over to you, Daisy.
Looking forward to that one. We're trying to avoid any of that awkward networking stuff. We're going to make it super fun and informal, and really just talking to other zebras about, what it is to live that life and to tread a different path when it comes to starting and growing your business. So so thank you everybody so much for coming along, for your questions and your participation. And there's been quite a lot of collaboration on Innovate UK grants in the chat, which we like to see. So hopefully that's the kind of thing that we can keep going with in our communities and as this event series progresses. So one more thank you to Astrid for joining us, and thank you, Esme, and we will, as promised, send out those links in a follow-up so you can join us for the remaining. Also, thank you again to Johnny for his participation. Okay then, thank you everybody.
Thank you.